Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang, and the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel, and it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And I am so glad once again to welcome founding friend David French. David, welcome back to the Good Faith Podcast. And the world is seeming very nonsensical these days. I'm not talking about the headlines. I'm talking about the standings in the Boston Baseball League fantasy baseball standings, which has you number one in our standings. The world is completely gone crazy, David. What's going on?
Well, I mean, it's hard to just keep raw talent down because I think what listeners also have to know is not only am I first in the Boston Baseball League, that's after drafting while also functioning as the draft manager and auctioneer throughout the entire thing. So I was double-hatted the whole time. But, just like raw ability, I was kind of like the, Jalen Brunson of the 2024 BBL draft. And for those listeners who aren't paying attention to the most exciting series in the NBA playoffs right now, Jalen Brunson is a Knicks guard who's doing pretty incredible things on the basketball court right now.
It would be less like Jalen Brunson. The fact that you're number one is less like your Jalen Brunson than like the fact that the 12th man on the bench suddenly has come off the bench to score 50. That's really what's going on. That's the better analogy.
That's just so wrong.
All right, David. Well, in making sense of the world together, we in the past have talked about making sense of institutions that have been doing damage in the world. Like we're talking about Russia invading Ukraine, social media companies driving polarization, Christian nationalists threatening democracy. However, when you and I were bandying about ideas for this podcast, I have to say, I was a little taken aback by your latest idea about how to analyze a harmful institution in the world. You wanted to take on, I believe, the youth club soccer team. Is that right, David?
I am declaring a fatwa against the youth sports as currently constituted in the United States. So, yeah, we were talking about, we were in the context of what are important things that are happening that don't have a particular political valence, but they're really impacting our lives, really impacting our lives. And the reason why I raised youth sports is several months ago, listeners might remember, I interviewed an author who had written a book about why people don't go to church anymore. And part of it is obviously because of all of the abuse scandals and the hyper politicization of the church and the animosity and the political divisions within church. That's a very, very real thing. But what struck me was that wasn't the story for most people. For most people, it was life happened. It would be the short way of saying it. And one of the elements of life happening was youth sports, was the all-consuming nature of youth sports. And that kind of got me going down this road, Curtis. And I'm just happy to share some of my thoughts about this, having been down the road ourselves as a family. I know you guys have been down that road.
Yep.
And then also, seeing friends and family go down that road and seeing some of the literature that's now emerging out there.
Okay, so let's break this down, because really what we're talking about is obviously not a particular youth club soccer team. We're talking about the culture of youth sports and how that has gotten institutionalized in a particular form. So let's break this down. David, what has changed in youth sports culture such that the institutions of that culture look very different than they did, say, when you and I were growing up? What's been this change for folks who may not be familiar with this transformation that's happened in the last 20 to 30 years?
Yeah. So I was a high school athlete when I was in high school, and my kids are high school athletes. And so I have sort of this, 20, 25, 30 year separation where you dive into the different cultures, the culture of youth sports in the 70s and 80s, the culture of youth sports in the 20-teens and 2020s. And they're so starkly different, Curtis, it's almost hard to describe it all. So for example, when I was coming up, there was no real sense, unless you were almost supernaturally gifted in one sport, that you specialized, for example. So The athletes that I went to school with would be 2, 3, 4 sport athletes, for example.
Yeah.
They would play baseball, they'd play basketball, they'd play football. And so you had much less specialization. That was one thing. Number two, it was much less time consuming. And so when your season ended, and your coach kind of stopped talking to you. you would go on to another sport or something else entirely. The summers were your summers. Now again, this is for the normal folks. The top tier people had a separate life than everybody else, but this is just your median high school athlete. Your summers were your summers. And so we had an enormous amount of time for just free play would be
pickup games.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I remember as a young kid in high school, I'm 15 years old. And sometimes I would just get up on Saturday morning. I'd walk out to my yard I'll walk out to my driveway and just start dribbling my basketball really hard. And I would see my friends like from all over the neighborhood come tearing out of their house. Yeah. And we would play pickup basketball for 2, 3, 4 hours at a time.
Yeah.
And then we might move on to pick up like just backyard football or whatever. And that was my sports experience growing up. Now we had very confined seasons where you'd have junior pro basketball or you'd have peewee football, but it was very short and confined. And so it wasn't really a dominant aspect of your family life. Again, unless you were top tier. It was just part of it all. It was not dominant. And there was a lot of liberty in that, a lot of free play in that. One of the downsides, I guess, is that sort of the overall quality of play of like high school sports was substantially less than what you see now. But and people were less, you see now in high school, just regular high school athletes who are just absolutely chiseled, absolutely at a level beyond what I would recognize when I was coming up. But it was a component of life that was important, but far from all consuming. It except in the height of the seasons, it did not conflict with the daily life and rhythm of the family so much as perhaps supplement it.
Okay, so we're talking about a profound transition where youth are spending so much more time specializing in a particular sports, often on a club team, AAU or the equivalents in various sports that take up a tremendously more amount of time. I have witnessed that myself, and I can tell the story of my youth and how it's different from, say, my daughter's experience in club basketball, totally different in the ways that you've described. Let's unpackage the stakes here. Why? What is the damage that this hyper specialization and hyper time consumption doing on? Let's start with the family. What is this doing for the family?
Well, and just to flesh out the hyper specialization and time consuming nature of everything. So what's fundamentally changed are a couple of things. One is if you want to play high school sports almost at all, not going on to play college. Like my kids didn't go on to be college athletes. You had to settle on your main sport early. You had to both pour into the school team, but then the school team would expect you to be part of travel ball, whether it's travel basketball, travel soccer, travel volleyball. So even if you're a median athlete, you're not extraordinary. You're going to pour yourself into these travel sports. And then the schools have a longer period of time to hold on to you. So for example, in Tennessee, they have some sway over you, except for like a short dead period right in the middle of the summer. So even the schools have some, their hooks in you. And so what ends up happening is if you're going to play high school sports at all, you find that for basically beginning in 6th grade, 7th grade, sometimes before then, an enormous amount of specialization in a kind of a year-round program. And then the travel teams are both expensive, often, and extraordinarily time-consuming. And I remember when my kids were much younger, I had a very busy job back then, Curtis. I was both in the Army Reserve and an active practicing lawyer doing constitutional cases around the country. So I had to travel for the Army, travel for my legal work, civilian work. And I felt so busy. And then I would interact with my slightly older peers who had high school age kids. And I would ask them how they were doing. And they say, I have no time. I have no time at all. I'm so busy. And I would think, oh, bless your heart. You don't know what busyness is. And then we got into that age bracket with our kids, and I repented. I was like, I repent. You guys were phenomenally busy. So your question was, what's the impact on the family? Well, I would put it this way. Imagine the difference between the parents' schedule and the parents' lives being Jupiter, and the kids' schedules and the kids' lives are the moons orbiting Jupiter. Okay. That's the way it was with me growing up. My parents' lives, my parents' profession, my parents' career, this was sort of the central schedule factor for the family. And we rotated around that. But what a lot of youth sports do is they flip that. And so then the students' lives, the students' schedule becomes Jupiter.
Yeah.
And then the parents' lives and the parents' schedules begin to orbit around that.
Yeah.
Which has enormous downline ramifications for both kids and adults. And so, for kids, for example, there's a couple of things that happen right then and there. One, since their schedule becomes sort of the center of the family universe around which everything else must yield, then it really is it's really creating the total kid-centered family, which I don't think is necessarily great for kids. To be at the center of family attention at such an early age where everyone has to sort of react to them, right? The other thing that it does is it's very disruptive. We have a big problem right now with adult men in particular and friendships. Yep. And we have a similar problem, but lesser, with adult women and friendships, that people have many fewer friends. So what ends up happening though, and I think one of the reasons is, depending on how many children you have, often you'll have a 5, 6, 7, 8, 10-year sort of hole ripped into your social life, so that the people that are your friends outside of the sports connections are often pushed to the side. And then the friends that you make inside the sports connections become primary, but they're transitory because the next year you might have a different team or you're on a different travel. And so you end up having sort of transitory relationships versus the more permanent relationships. You flip the priority of the family to where kids are center versus the adults are center. And we're just getting started. We're just getting started.
This is absolutely true. I mean, if you talk to anybody who's enmeshed, any family that's enmeshed in this youth sports culture, which is so based on getting on club, travel teams, and so forth, it absolutely is a disruptor in relationships. We've seen that in our own church and our own friendship networks. You just disappear, like you said, for 5 or 6 years while these people are constantly driving their kids from one tournament to another, one practice to another. And it becomes really like the scheduling dance you have to do to try to get just 2 families together, much less 3 families together.
Oh gosh.
It's like exponentially almost impossible at that point to find even just a weekend to that where all 3 families can be together. And so I think it is actually, you're right, it is a factor that is driving the fragmentation of our social ties. And so that's what it's doing to our family. And also, I think the other thing that you have to say is it just makes, as you pointed out earlier, it makes the family's participation in a common life very difficult. Just apart from family to family, the family itself, to simply go to church together regularly. I mean, it becomes a really fraught experience, or because of weekend as the travel calendar and so forth. And so families themselves end up doing the dividing and conquering thing where, if you've got multiple kids, the husband is taking the daughter to the volleyball tournament, the wife is taking the son to the basketball tournament. And they're not spending much time even together as a family, much less cross-family relationships.
Yes. No, and I think what's really important about this is when you're thinking through just sort of let's get bigger, let's get more meta for a minute. One of the big problems we have right now in the country is declining birth rates. And this is true across the developed world. By the way, this is not a uniquely American problem. But here's what's fascinating, Curtis. you might say, well, American adults are having fewer children because they're selfish and they want to have a prosperous lifestyle without kids, etc. But if you actually look at the data, we have fewer children and spend more time with our kids than historically. And again, this is true across the developed world, except in one country, France. French parents spend less
The French
time
are like, hey,
with
you
their
guys go
kids.
off. We're going to sip with some wine here.
Yeah, right, exactly. But we spend more time with our children in the aggregate, even though we have fewer children than we did 25, 30, 35 years ago. And this is one of the reasons here, Curtis. This is one of the reasons because you have two children and you have two parents, and then you're often doing two separate, you're dividing and conquering, as you were saying. Well, now how do you divide and conquer when it becomes 3? How do you divide and conquer when it becomes 4? Then often you're so busy you can't even imagine adding another child to a family. And so I'm not blaming this all on youth sports, just to be super clear, but this is one of these factors that's playing into this much larger amount of time we're spending with our kids, even as we have fewer children, and which is an interesting paradox and really kind of cuts against the selfish parent narrative.
Yeah. So let's then talk about, that's what it's doing to our families.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about what it's doing to the youth themselves. Because it strikes me that this is really connected to all the attention that's being paid to Jonathan Haidt's work, where he's talking about the loss of the play-based childhood.
Oh, yeah.
And this is people have to understand the youth sports culture and the institution of these club sports and tournaments and so forth. It does not feel like play. It is not play. As a matter of fact, it is so very different than, David, what you and I were describing our childhood, where after school, it's you grab 5 or 6 or 7 friends and like, let's have a pickup basketball game. Let's have a sandlot baseball game. It's not, that's creative, open-ended, self-directed play. This is participating in an industry. I mean, the rules are laid out for you. The practice is regimented. The stakes feel very high. And in terms of, creating anxiety among kids, and whether you'll make the team, you'll get playing time, how will your coach view you? It's totally different than the after school pickup games that you and I had. And so kids are getting less play that research shows is crucial for developing resilience and kind of a approach towards life that is open to risk and experimentation, that hardens them against the anxiety sort of impulses, and instead subjects them to almost like adult performance pressures at a very early age. So do you have more to say about what this is doing to our youth, David?
Yeah. So I think you hit it really well. So number one, don't think of youth sports as play. Just get that out of your mind right now. It is a highly disciplined, high pressure activity. It is not play like I had when I was in middle school or in high school. Even as a high school athlete, I had a lot of time to just have fun with friends and play a lot of sports, but play, not as a part of a directed activity. So number one, you're removing a lot of play. What does that mean? Well, one thing it means is, quite frankly, less joy in your childhood, because play, as the name implies, is fun.
Yeah.
You don't learn how to resolve disputes with your peers.
Yeah.
And this is a big issue with the loss of the play-based childhood. This is not a made-up thing. It is, you have a generation of kids who learn that when they face adversity, because they're constantly being adult supervised, constantly, their immediate reflexive reaction is to appeal to authority every time they face distress. And they're taught that from sort of day one. So between school environments, which are for good and ill, much more strict in many ways against when there's student disputes than there used to be, or now moving into this youth sports environment, you're beginning to have a situation where kids are very rarely unsupervised. And so what that means is they don't learn to resolve disputes, and they don't learn that sort of independent decision making. Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, my friend Greg Lukianoff, when they wrote their book, The Coddling of the American Mind, one of the interesting things that they would do is they would ask audiences when they were speaking, when was the first time that you you yourself, Gen X or young boomer parent, when was the first time you were let out of the house with no supervision?
Yeah.
And the general answer is 7, 8, 9 years old. I mean, for me, it was probably 7 or 8 years old.
That's right.
When
Yeah.
yeah. And then they ask, well, how old were your kids before you let them out completely unsupervised? And the answer is more like 14, 15.
Yeah.
And some of that is deliberate parental choice of saying, okay, I think the world's too dangerous for you to be outside by yourself, although the world was much less dangerous than when you and I were growing up, Curtis. Yeah. So some of it is parental perception of danger, and some of it is just when. When are you going to do it? And by the way, even if you're a parent who wants to have your kid out there bouncing the basketball and have the run of the neighborhood,
who are they going to do that with?
All the other kids are at travel sports. Yeah. So there's a huge issue of a collective action problem, because if I'm a parent and I say I want to be a free range, high play parent, with whom? And that gets very, very difficult. And it's very difficult to find other parents who sort of have the same view. But then if you have that view, then what decision are you making for your kids regarding high school sports?
Yeah. Well, so that's at the sort of their mental, emotional formation is being really damaged by this new institutionalized version of sports, youth sports. I think there's also physical damage. The studies show the increasing rates of injury showing up in young people that are just, was unheard of 30 years ago, ACL, MCL, that are clearly injuries that are from repetitive stress. These are injuries that are because you are practicing the same motions over and over and over again on young bodies. Versus, again, David, you and I, we just never concentrated that much on one sport. So we actually developed different muscles, different kinds of movements and so forth. That actually turns out to be a great protector against injury, because you're not overstressing joints, you're not overstressing tendons and ligaments, and you're developing a more sort of rounded body, maybe less chiseled for a particular sport, but actually healthier in the long run.
Well, my son finished his high school career after having had 3 surgeries during high school for sports-related injuries. He had a freak accident injury when he was playing when he was in allegedly a no-contact drill in football, and got smashed during a no-contact drill with no pads on, and he broke his jaw, and that required 2 surgeries. He broke his nose playing basketball. That required a surgery. And, look, I mean, stuff happens. I broke my arm playing basketball in elementary school, but the sort of the intensity of it all, of it all is just it's at a different level. And the other thing that comes into play here also is the amount of pressure that is put on a very significant number of kids, not all. My kids, we never put any pressure on them to be good enough to get a college scholarship or whatever, but what we witnessed was an enormous number of parents that we interacted with were putting an enormous amount of pressure on these kids in these travel teams, because they viewed their success in the travel teams and their success in sports as their ticket into college, either their ticket into an elite college with perhaps not quite as good academics, because one of the ways to get into a Harvard is to be a really good student who's also awesome at lacrosse, right? And so
or golf or diving,
yes, exactly. Yeah, we remember the Netflix, the special on all these parents who are arrested for defrauding their kids.
Operation Varsity Blues. Yeah.
Operation Varsity Blues, where people were fake rowers and fake sailor, but the real thing is a real thing, which is, hey, Brittany, if you get really good at volleyball, you can go to Harvard, even if you don't have the 1500 SAT. So it becomes part of that tiger parent persona. Now, I don't know, you're in the West Coast and there's a lot of tiger parents around academics. We're going to get you the violin lessons. We're going to get you the piano lessons. You're going to have calculus when you're in 9th grade, like that kind of pressure. Where I live, you see a lot less of that. And you see a lot more of, I need to see you hit a 40-yard field goal. Like I need to see you make all academic all-state in lacrosse. I need to see you. And the goal is, interestingly enough, often not, well, I don't think they're going to be pros. I don't think they're going to make their living playing sports. But the goal is this is your ticket entry either into college, the college of your choice, or making the college of your choice more affordable.
Yeah.
And so there is, this is what I've seen, just this very intense pressure on, say, a 10th grader playing volleyball, that somehow their future, part of their future is at stake.
Yeah.
In these 10th grade travel team games.
Yeah.
And that's a lot to put on a 16-year-old.
Yeah. Well, and finally, the last, we can say more about the damage this is wreaking, but I just want to call out the spiritual damage that's happening in all of this, because in my youth, so much of my spiritual formation happened in youth group with peers that we were combination playing together, but also worshiping together, studying scripture together, holding each other accountable. That takes time. That takes a tremendous amount of time to develop those kinds of peer connections built around spiritual formation. You talk to any youth director in any sort of urban professional sort of environment, they will tell you the biggest barrier they're fighting is youth sports, because it makes the formation of a youth group that is consistent, that has the relationships with one another, that has time to do these kinds of deep spiritual formation, which just for youth especially just takes time. You can't, they're not going to get together and it's like, okay, let's do an hour of Bible study. It just for youth development doesn't work that way. And so every youth pastor that I've talked to recently talks about youth sports culture as their biggest obstacle to spiritually forming our youth. And I think that is a factor in these declining rates of church participation, is because the reality is youth haven't been formed in the ways that youth naturally are formed spiritually. That's being sucked out of them. And youth sports culture is a big driver of that. So this has mammoth ramifications for the youth themselves in terms of their own spiritual well-being, but also for the church in terms of how we are nurturing their next generation.
Well, and the other thing is habits once broken are hard to reform again. So, one of the things I think that you see with some of the post-COVID reality is some people who maybe were not super invested or involved in church, but had gone as a matter of sort of course, got used to not going. And it's hard to reform that habit again. And so one of the things that's very difficult, I think, is to sort of say, okay, we've built a lifestyle around church that is where we're invested in church. We as the adults are invested in participating in the life of the church beyond just showing up on Sunday mornings. You as kids, we're investing you in the life of the church through the children's ministries, and then moving on to youth. And then you go, time out. We need about a 7-year break here. And that's exaggerating a little bit, but not much, for some of these, when we tried hard we tried to have it both ways, Curtis. We tried to have the kids play high school sports and lean into church as much as is humanly possible. And we found it really difficult. And there were periods where we fell prey to the collective action problem. And we're like, should our kids not be in school sports, even though they certainly have the ability to be and take joy in being on the high school team because of all this? And we tried to square the circle all those years. And I don't know how well we did it. I don't know how well we pulled it off, but it's really hard. It's really hard because you're letting people down either way. You're letting down your teammates by not showing up or not doing the other things that they're also doing for the team. But then you're letting down, you have relationships at church, and so it is,
it's a lot of pressure to put on a young 13-year-old.
It's a lot. It's a lot, much less the parents who are trying to.
David, we've talked about the damage it's causing. Let's do some diagnosis. What's the underlying engine here? Why have we all fallen prey to this kind of culture that none of us is really enjoying that much? It's causing us stress. It's causing stress to our youth. How did we get caught into this?
So this is one of the reasons why it is very hard for individuals to escape systems without creating other systems. that they can find a home, or individuals to escape institutions without creating other institutions where
That's
they
right.
can find that home.
Okay, so there's sociological factors like the law of collective action, the problem of collective actions that's driving these institutional problems. Let's talk economics. What are the economics of youth sports that are in play that keep sucking up more and more time from youth? Because this is now a big industry. Youth sports tournaments and so forth. It's at a totally different level in terms of the dollars and the incentives in play. So let's break that down.
Well, once you create an institution that is widely viewed as mandatory for childhood development,
Yeah.
you're basically an ATM machine at that point. Like your money is just flying. It's, imagine one of those ATM machines is broken. It's just starting to spit money at you.
Yeah.
So when you create these institutions that have become over time indispensable in the view of many parents, and
Yeah.
a sad necessity in the view of many other parents,
Yeah.
the money flows in. But by the way, not from everybody,
That's right.
because then you begin to create class distinctions. So there is an enormous fall off. What you're seeing, interestingly enough, is even though we have a youth play culture, I think there's going to be a lot of upper middle class listeners are going to be like, yep. And then there's going to be some listeners who are not in that income category are going to be like, I don't know what you're talking about, or that's not a world we can live in.
Yeah.
And so it's creating class-based distinctions, as it is families with extra disposable income who are able to really pour into this, which then creates a vicious cycle, because once high-income people start pouring into it, then the consequence is that the sports marketing world views the high-income world as its natural constituency.
Right.
And so the price restraints go out the window, all of these things. And so you begin to have a situation where it's just really expensive to do it.
Yeah.
And then once this kid shows ability, even if the parents are kind of, are quite sensible and say, hey, look, we're not pressuring you to do this for scholarships. We're going to, we're not thinking that you have to do this to make college affordable. A lot of coaches will say that to kids, even if you're trying to sort of keep things in perspective. And so the kids at an early age start to feel like this sport that they're working on is actually somewhat kind of like a job, because it's how they're going to earn the money that they might feel like they have to live out their dreams. And the percentage of these athletes who actually get substantial scholarships or substantial admissions breaks is really small relative to sort of the way the promise is extended.
Yeah.
And I've been in these meetings where I'm at a travel volleyball team and I'm looking at a room full of young girls, and maybe 10% of them have real scholarship possibility. Yeah. But the coach is up there saying, every one of you girls can potentially earn a free ride. And do you know what that means for your family? Do you know what that means? Whoa, that's a lot, Yeah. And so as a parent, grab the kid afterwards. No. Don't think that college depends on how well you play volleyball when you're 14. But this is, part of the way that culture works.
All right, final layer of analysis. We've talked about the sociological, the economic drivers. Let's talk about the spiritual drivers. What is happening such that you see the same dynamic among Christians as you do non-Christians, the same buying into the false promises of youth sports culture? What is the spiritual dysfunction, do you think, in play among Christians that we are not more inoculated, we are not more defended against the damage that this kind of institution causes? I am particularly thinking about this sort of idea that, you talked about how a youth can start to thinking about their sports as their jobs. I also think they start thinking about it as their identity.
Yeah,
they start thinking about, like, I am a basketball player, I am a football player, I am a volleyball player. And it strikes me that there's we've not somehow formed our kids enough that their identity really is in Christ. It's such that there's a bulwark against false definitions of who they are. What might be other sort of spiritual dysfunctions in play, David?
That's a really good question. what I have seen happen is, and it goes back to some of the previous things that we've talked about. One is I have seen resentment when kids are removed from it. It can create conflict and resentment with the kids because they don't necessarily have the same long view as the parents. And all they're
Right.
seeing is now I am not quite like my peers. And
Right.
is it not enough that I don't cuss? Is it not enough that I read my Bible? Is it not enough that all my favorite songs come from Bethel or Hillsong? Like, is that not enough? Now I have to be completely like I'm separate from my friends.
Yeah.
You know, I'm going to this youth group that's full of kids that don't share my interests. And so one of the things is you begin to see that kids will feel as if they need to do this, as we talked about earlier, to feel fully included. And there will be resentment directed at parents for essentially making them sacrifice too much, right? It's just too much. It's too much of a sacrifice. And so the parents will often yield to that because they think, well, there's nothing inherently wrong with volleyball. Like volleyball's fine. You know, there's nothing wrong with volleyball. And by the way, isn't it legalistic to say that you have to be in church every single week? And, you know, you start to negotiate and bargain with yourself in this way. And so that tension, it can build tension between parent and child. It can build resentment between parent and child. And so that all of that has a spiritual cost.
Yeah. All right. We're talking with David French about what is youth sports culture doing to us. And we are been doing some diagnosis of the damage, diagnosis of the underlying drivers. I want to start talking more about what we can do to actually be more intentional in the way that David's talking about. So David, let's flip the question. Rather than ask, what is the youth sports culture doing to us? Let's ask the proactive question, what should we be doing around youth sports? You've talked about the need to be more intentional. And so I think that's a really helpful lens. But one of the things we've also talked about is it's really hard to be intentional alone because this is a system problem. This is a problem of our institutions and how institutions are acting upon us. And it's very hard for an individual or even an individual family to counteract the effects of an entire system, entire institution. So let's just get creative and go to the whiteboard here for a moment. Without trying to get too locked down into, is this possible? Is this practical? Let's imagine what would a healthy, sort of truly spiritually healthy and physically healthy, emotionally healthy, socially healthy youth sports culture look like? What are we trying to build here?
Yeah, you know, that's a really good question. So I've got a few sort of like just scattershot thoughts here. So
let's be clear. Neither of us think we've got the answers here.
No. So, this is a problem with a capital P, and I'm not going to solve it for you because I don't know the solution. I've just got some thoughts. So here's one thought. One of the best churches I've ever belonged to was our church in Georgetown, Kentucky, when Nancy and I were early married. And what they did is they created their own sports culture. So we had a basketball league, but it wasn't just a youth league. It was all of us. And the youth were once you reached a certain age, youth were with the adults. And And so we had our own church basketball league. We had our own church softball league. You know, we had things like this that everybody participated in. And it was a ton of fun. B, it really integrated the family together. Dads were playing basketball with their sons, you know?
Yeah.
And then C, for that set of students who were not apex level athletes, but it gave them a league that they could belong to, that they could turn and say to their high school coach, "Yeah, I've got a league. I'm doing a league." So that was a neat idea.
I love that idea. Yeah, no, to have actually intergenerational play and actually family life built into sports. Now that may not be accessible to everybody, to a listener out there who's thinking like, I can't play basketball. I can't play volleyball. Let's think about creative solutions about how Christians still can make other choices because they're doing it together. Maybe not all the way to forming your own league, but what are other choices that a group of 3 or 4 families could say, hey, let's do this.
Well, one thing that I think that you can, and because parent peer pressure is a big issue here as well.
Yeah.
Because other parents will judge you if you're not at every single one of these games and practices, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes they'll even say things to your kid. Where's your dad? Well, I'm really sorry, and then make your kid feel like but anyway, teaching your children that in does not necessarily have to mean all in
Yeah.
for both parent and child. And so, in other words, if there are 8 weekend tournaments, for example, say you're going to miss some of those.
Yeah.
You're just, you're going to miss, and you lead in with the coach to begin with, and you say, hey, my son, my daughter is not going to be able to be at everything.
Yeah.
And now that might mean they don't have as much playing time, but in does not have to mean all in for the kid and for you. So the other thing is you have to shun this thing that says, well, the best way to be a parent is to be at everything. Yeah. Well, again, what is that doing? It's changing who is the planet and who is the moon. Yeah. And if you're saying that to be a good parent, that means that you have to essentially follow your kid to everything. Again, that's really centering the child as the central person in the family. And as much as you love your kids, centering someone where the sun rises and sets on their schedule when they're 14 or 15, I don't think that's building necessarily sort of humility or sort of a concept of, self-denial. It sort of teaches them at an early age is that, the role of everyone is to pour into you. Yeah. And I think that sends some messages. So I think one is if you are part of an institution of a church, you can think creatively about how you can use your institution to create alternatives. 2, if you're not part of an institution, you're just a parent, you can realize that there's a difference between in and all in. And then number 3, think really hard about the possibility of just opting out. Yeah. Because it is also the case that you know your kids in many ways better than they know themselves. And so, especially earlier in their age, and what they really want to do may not be what is best for them. And they may not have the ceiling that they think they have athletically or whatever. And so it is possible. And then, the last thing is I would say, understand that there's a lot of common frustration that parents have. And being open about that and sort of working with other parents about everything from how do you modulate the practice schedule for this travel team, because they can't have a travel team without the parents. Yeah. And sort of thinking through, hey, do we need 4 days a week? Is that what we really need? Because is it so important in this regional AAU league that we go 14 and 8 as opposed to 12 and 10? Those kinds of hard, discussions with other parents who I guarantee you, there's going to be some percentage of parents on these travel teams who are all in. My kid's going to get that lacrosse scholarship, whatever. But you're going to have a big group who are, whoa, boy, am I doing this for the 5th straight weekend? Really? Or are we traveling again? Really? And so all of these things, but, a lot of people will hear just what I said and find it deeply unsatisfying. Yeah. Because it's not a solution. Yeah. I think one part of a solution is you cannot have a solution until the problem is widely understood enough. Yeah.
It's a huge problem. And I just want to re-echo, we're not saying we've got the solution, but we want to sound the call that it's time for us to look at this problem as parents and start thinking about creative solutions. One thing that I also want to think that as part of the solution is there are some sort of collective and potentially even institutional solutions that we need, but I also don't want to actually let us off the hook for individual spiritual work that we as parents need to do around this issue. And I think about this a lot because, I have sometimes other peers that we're among a certain peer group, we're a bit on the older side. So we've had kids who have already gone through adolescence, they're moving into young adulthood. And I often get this question of people saying, well, hey, do you have any tips who are a few years behind us? Do you have any tips about, how to raise healthy kids? And I don't know, we've done a great job on that. But one thing that is my most common bit of advice I say to that is, look, the hard work of adolescence that people do talk about is that the adolescents are differentiating themselves from their parents. And that's hard work to carve out who I am apart from my parents. what people don't often tell you is there's a corresponding spiritual work that needs to happen on the parent side during that process, which is they have to actually differentiate themselves from their kids. And what that means is their own identity and worth that have to not be so tied up to the performance of their kids. And I think that's a spiritual driver here in this youth sports culture, which is parents have not done enough work to actually differentiate their own identity and worth from the performance of their kids, such that they're actually in it with their kids, with every practice, with every play, wincing with this lack of playing time or this blown layup and so forth, and such that they're actually contributing to this sort of need for ever greater levels of performance, which is really what's seized upon by these club teams and youth sports culture. And so I really think there's something that we also need to do as parents to say, you know what, we're going to really wean ourselves off from this whole performance culture and our enmeshing of ourselves with our kids in their performance.
Yeah, I think that you raised a ton of good points in that in those comments, and it really reminds me, if I had to just sort of step back, it really reminds me of something that I've talked about in the context of when husbands and wives and their careers and how demanding their careers can be and should be for family flourishing. And I'll never forget this parenting advice we got from a friend of ours years and years and years ago. He said, here's what I've told my kids. You can question everything, but you have to obey first. In other words, if I say we're not doing X or Y, you have to not do it. But you can ask me why, and I will always tell you. I will explain why. And so I think that earlier, maybe even than we begin to think, we need to start moving at incorporating our kids sort of into the understanding of who we are as a family and why we do what we do as a family. And I think you'd be surprised how much even younger children can buy into that, can buy into a sense of mission and purpose. And so I do think that there is a way in which you can avoid the sort of accidental investment of time, avoid stumbling into all of this, and really have a way in which I guess the best at the end of the day, intentionality is sort of the best advice I've got is. Beware the way in which we stumble into a lifestyle that we never imagined for ourselves.
Right.
And that's what we did with social media in many ways. That's what we've done with youth sports in many ways. We've stumbled into a lifestyle that we never would have wanted. And so back up and having intentionality and resolve and flexibility.
Yeah, there's no one right answer for everybody.
No.
There's no recipe that's gonna, fit every life circumstance. We're not saying, pull out of every possible youth sports culture club that your kid may be part of. But let's be thoughtful. Let's be together. Let's look for partners, look for friends, look for other families that you can have these conversations and make perhaps even some common decisions around choosing differently, choosing more healthily. So David, this has been a great conversation. And listeners, if you've got thoughts on this topic, one way you can actually let us know what you think is by actually leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Go ahead and leave a review, leave a rating, and then in that comment box, you can tell us what you think about this topic. Hey, and David, one little bit of good news. We've crossed a threshold that I'm really happy. So as listeners know, David and I, and along with Russell Moore, have been leading this project called the After Party, which is trying to move Christians toward healthier Christian politics. And David, we are now officially live in all 50 states. The After Party is being held by churches or small groups in every single state. Hawaii, Alaska, Nevada was the holdout. So we finally battered down the obstacles over.
We have penetrated the casino capital of America. It's fantastic.
It's just going great guns. We probably have over 50,000 users and individual users at this point and growing rapidly. The uptake has been really tremendous at our DC event. We just got some great encouraging feedback of people telling us real stories about how the after party is really making a difference in their churches, communities, and small groups. So thank you to all you out there who have been trying the after party. Please keep telling us stories. Send your emails in about the stories of the effect that it's having. And we're going to keep telling those stories, those tales from the after party here on The Good Faith in the upcoming months. All right, that's it for today. David, thank you so much for joining us once again on the Good Faith podcast.
And thank you, Curtis. This was fun.
And listeners, next week, we will once again join together in that place of play and community, the Good Faith Podcast Campfire. See you then.